In this video, I'm going to be giving my Cyberpunk 2077 first impressions. We got the game yesterday, just before the embargo dropped on Twitch, like minutes before. So I've played the game about 9 hours at this point. So I don't think I have quite enough time to do a full review, but I wanted to give you guys my first impressions of the game. The first thing I want to talk about is the graphics of the game. I think there's probably no doubt that what we're seeing now with the game is not quite as good of graphics as what we were seeing during presentations a year or two ago. In fact, from what I've understood, that Cyberpunk was actually asking people to use the B-roll footage for their reviews given. I think this was intentionally trying to make the game look better than what it actually looks like. It's not to say the game looks bad, because it really doesn't. It plays very smoothly from my experience. But the graphics aren't really going to blow your mind. One thing that, adds a little bit of something to the game, but is probably not what you'd expect from a high-budget game, is really the ragdoll physics, like when you're driving around in the car. This is something that really catches your attention. It looks very budget studio when you see it. Like, it's just really awkward, and it's very humorous. Don't get me wrong, I really enjoyed it in the game, but it's not something you would expect to see in a AAA game. There is one other aspect to this, though, and that's I think there is a certain style to the game that's intentionally tried to be like 80s retro. If you look at certain areas of the game, they don't try to look great. They actually try to give this retro feel. I actually really like that about the game. So when you look at some of these areas and you're like, well, that doesn't look that great, I think this was a design choice on purpose to try and give this game a retro-like feel, and I really like it. The next thing I want to talk about is the pacing of the game. In the 9 or so hours I've played so far, it's very, very slow. A lot of people were saying that, the first 6 hours is the prologue, which I can confirm this is true, and then it starts to pick up after that. So I'm about 3 hours after finishing that prologue. The game hasn't really picked up a ton, so I'm hoping that it picks up more. It's sort of alluding to that it's going to. I think people a little bit are going to complain about this aspect. It's not a negative for me. I really enjoy the role-playing aspect of the game. In fact, I feel like there's far more role-playing than I was expecting compared to something like, the Fallout games, the recent Fallout games. There's dialogues in those games, and you're interacting with characters in those games. But Cyberpunk has far more immersion into the game world and the main story than Fallout does, for instance. Fallout feels more like you're just playing around in a wasteland and you happen to be doing quests. Cyberpunk feels a bit more tailored to you, and I really like that. I know that something people have been complaining a lot recently is the fact that games feel more and more like movies and less like games. You saw this with Death Stranding, you saw this with The Last of Us 2, where it felt maybe more like you were moving your character through a movie, through the motions to get to the next cutscene, than it actually felt like you were playing a game. This wasn't always true, obviously, but there were big stretches of the game in Last of Us 2 and even more stretches in Death Stranding where this was the case. This is somewhat true for Cyberpunk as well. There are stretches where it just feels like you're moving your character around. The exception here, or the difference here, I should say, is that you aren't as much on rails with it as those games. Those games were like scripted cutscenes. Here, you're able to look around and see what's going on in your environment when you're talking. You can look up, you can look down, as if you're having the conversation there presently, and the game doesn't just completely take over for you, which I really appreciate. In some ways, though, it reminds me of something like Red Dead Redemption 2, where in between missions, you can run around and do whatever the hell you want, and that's fine. But once you're on a mission, it's like it's on rails. So if you like that sort of gameplay where you can go fuck around if that's what you want to do, that's fine, and then come back and do the mission, then you should like this, but it is a bit slower paced than I think a lot of people are expecting. Talking about the atmosphere of the game, Cyberpunk absolutely smashes it out of the park here. When you think of a super dystopian future that's based around capitalism, they nail it. I mean, everything is around selling things to you and consuming things. It very much reminds me of the way the world is going, and they absolutely kind of hit really, really close to home here. They did so in a very humorous way, I think, a bit over the top, which lightens it a bit. But there is sort of a dark humor there when you sort of see the parallels between things in the game and real life. But they absolutely crush it in this regard. When you're walking around, it feels like a very modern dystopian future. And frankly, something that you could possibly see yourself living in the not too distant future. Another thing that really helps to that immersion is the voice acting in the game. The voice acting is phenomenal. They have some very, very good voice actors, and obviously Keanu Reeves is a huge draw to the game. And, as we were talking about, as I mentioned, it makes you feel like you're playing a movie a little bit, but Hollywood quality acting is excellent in video games. Whenever you have Hollywood quality acting in a video game, and so I think this is very, very good for the game. Talking about the music, the game's soundtrack is awesome. I have it set in the mode that disables the copyrighted content, obviously, so that our videos don't get pulled down. But even still with that on, it doesn't remove a ton of the music, and it's just absolutely amazing. You feel like you're in this, sort of futuristic 80s setting, and the music just conveys that completely, and you feel totally immersed. Now, I've said a lot of good things about the game, but probably my biggest criticism of the game itself is the gameplay loop. It is not revolutionary. You go here, you pick up a quest, you go talk to some people, you decide how to resolve it, you either shoot them or steal from them or blackmail them or whatever outcome you have. Kind of plays a little bit like Fallout, the modern Fallout games in that regard. And then you go back and, where your quest ends, and then you go pick up another quest. It's not groundbreaking. It's fun, it's good, it's decent, but it's not great. I think one of the reasons that it's not is that the game, frankly, has a ton of options of what you can do during, like, let's say, combat scenarios when you're, having a gunfight. There's a ton of options. You can hack things, you can stealth, you can go in guns blazing, et cetera, and these options just open up more and more to you as the game progresses. But the game does a terrible job of explaining a lot of how this works, even after doing the tutorial. And the UI is very, very difficult to read because of the stylized choices of the game. And it makes it even more difficult for someone to like really understand what is possible for them to do. What does doing X, Y, and Z actually do in the game? And so it kind of, unless you spend a good amount of time looking through it, sort of limits you to just pointing and shooting. Pointing and shooting has been done a lot in video games, so that's not particularly enthralling. And I bet if you spent a lot of time like really going through everything, you would have a lot better experience. So I highly recommend, take some time, do the tutorials, dig into the menu screens, do some research, watch a guide or two. We're going to put up some, so we'll get that out to you as soon as you can. And better understand the game, because it reminds me a little bit of, other games with convoluted mechanics where if you don't understand them, then they completely go right over your head. Talking about bugs and glitches of the game, I got to a certain point of the game, I finished the tutorial quest, the game crashed, then it got into a crash loop. I went into the GOG menu based on what some people in chat were saying, disabled the overlay for GOG, that fixed the crashing completely. There were a couple of glitches in the game. I had one quest that kind of bugged out, and I just had to reload it again and do it again, and it was fine. And I had, some graphical things with like Jackie walking through a car, or an object just floating in air all by itself, or one guy hit with a car just sort of like ragdolled out into space. But nothing really, really major. I haven't had any file corruption or any save issues or any hangs during load screens or anything like that. So I think so far it's about what I would say is in the range of acceptable for a game of this size. Whether that's acceptable to you from a studio like CD Projekt Red is up to you. But for me, it's within my range of what's acceptable so far, if just barely. The last thing I want to talk about is the absolute irony of Cyberpunk 2077. Here is a game about capitalism in overdrive. Basically, if you can make money, you should make money. You should get the most money you can. It doesn't matter if it's from stealing, it's from drugs, from sex, whatever. It's just pay me, I'll do something, and I'll spend my money to do whatever to make sure I have an advantage so that I can make more money and that everyone else is fucked as long as I'm not fucked. What is ironic about that is that here is a game handled by a game studio that basically did everything they possibly could in the corporate world to sell their game. They spent millions of dollars marketing it. They got it into select people's hands so that it would be positioned perfectly to sell as many copies as possible. They only released it and let people use B-roll instead of the actual footage of the game in order to sell it more. They basically did what they marketed their game to be in order to sell as much as they could. And that is the fucking irony of this game. You have a studio that's willing to do whatever it has to sell copies of a game that made a game about someone who will do whatever they have to make money. It's obviously a bit early to make a final review of this game, and I'm sure I'll have a final impressions video or review out in a couple days. But right now, what I would say is this. The game is in a playable state. If you've been looking forward to playing Cyberpunk, you should be able to play with a minimal bugs, and you should be fine. I did not have a ton. Nothing stopped my progression. I had to reload once, and there was some, weird graphical things on the screen. But it is very much in a playable state right now, so if you want to play, play. If you've watched gameplay and your opinion has changed, you think it's too slow, or it's not what you had hoped for, then wait. I think the gameplay feedback or the gameplay loop of the game is not mind-blowing to me. It's not a game that I'm going to go, earlier we had made a video about this is the game of the decade. Everything I saw, pointed to that. CD Projekt Red did an excellent job marketing, and they fooled me. This is not a game of the year game for me. This is a game that you could probably play and enjoy, and most people probably will, but it is not a game of the year. It wouldn't win game of the year. Ghost of Tsushima is a better game than this. Nioh 2 is a better game than this. There are a lot of better games than this. That's not to say it's not on the top tier of games, because it is, but it is not the best game that came out this year.